Russia is not ready to abandon military pressure on Ukraine. According to Vadym Skibitsky, deputy chief of the main directorate of intelligence of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, the Russian Federation is not demonstrating a readiness for a ceasefire and is not counting on reaching any agreements or signing a peace treaty before the end of the year. Moreover, according to him, the Russian army continues to strike at the Ukrainian defense industrial complex, military facilities, energy, logistics, and gas station infrastructure.
There are no signs on the battlefield that indicate Russia's readiness to cease fire and begin normal negotiations. Their plans are as such, and this is what they are saying. There will be no agreements or signing of a peace treaty before the end of this year. Putin wants to achieve the goals he has set for himself. These are, first and foremost, the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Their General Stas plans are to complete the capture of the Donetsk region by the end of this year. Vadym Skibitsky, deputy chief of the main directorate of intelligence of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, in an interview with RBC Ukraine.
Ukrainian presidential advisor Mykhailo Podolyak joins us now. Mykhailo, greetings.
Yes, hello.
It is one thing when political analysts and political strategists say it. It is another thing to hear such words from a major general of the GUR. Skibitsky is not making his first statement that, on the field, on the ground, everything proves the most belligerent plans of the Russian Federation. What is the point, then, of peace tracks, of negotiations? We are waiting for Witkoff in Kiev with Kushner. How does this reconcile, Mykhailo?
It reconciles directly with the so-called aspects of international politics. That is, you must demonstrate readiness for something. Clearly show your status quo, your position. Ukraine is clearly showing that it wants an end to the active phase of the war. There are concrete, realistic scenarios for defending. That is, what needs to be done so that the hostilities end here and now. And accordingly, Ukraine is providing its argumentation for all of this. And Russia, for its part, is demonstrating its status quo, that they do not want to exit the war and will not do so. Mr. Skibitsky is absolutely right here. That is, there are no signs, neither in rhetoric, nor in actions, nor in what is happening within Russia itself, nor from the perspective of what Russia is currently demonstrating in this war, meaning the strikes, the massive ballistic strikes on the civilian population, that Russia is ready to exit the war as such. That's all there is to it. So, we must understand this perfectly well. And our partners must understand it too. I mean, performative actions are certainly important for reputation, but actions that don't lead to any further consequences look negative for one's reputation. There are countries ready to fulfill the role of mediators, but one still needs to live up to that role, meaning it also has certain requirements. And accordingly, we want our partners to understand two basic things. Without coercing Russia, not Ukraine, I emphasize again, Russia, there would be nothing. There would be no negotiation process. And second, we won't get by with just talk about coercion. That is, these must be sanctions of a different level. This must be military support for Ukraine of a different level. So accordingly, again, direct, immediate impact on the territory, on the electorate, on Putin, directly on his inner circle, direct military impact. Perhaps this is the only thing that will lead to a negotiation process. I'll summarize here once more, yes? That is, Ukraine is demonstrating readiness for a real diplomatic process. Ukraine is demonstrating realistic scenarios for ending the war, the only ones possible. Ukraine is demonstrating the reasoning for why this can only be done in such a format. And at the same time, Russia is clearly and demonstratively showing everyone its unwillingness to end the genocidal war it is waging. And accordingly, again, the question arises before our partners, neutral countries, and international institutions. Do we continue to watch as the subject Putin commits genocide against the population of another country without any motive, without the slightest motive? Or are we, after all, taking some actions to stop this? And what actions have we just examined together? The economy and the military.
Mikhail, lately, when summing up the results of successful Ukrainian strikes on Russian infrastructure, some observers, let's say from the category of Russians who have left Russia, are saying that the goals are unattainable by such methods, that Russian society, permeated with resentment and Putinism, will, on the contrary, become more aggressive as a result of successful Ukrainian operations. How would you answer him?
Oh, is there any need to answer them? Because I don't consider them to be a subject that influences anything. Yeah, debating with non-subjects is very strange. But let's look at the question differently here. Are Russians behaving peacefully in this war right now, man? So right now we don't have escalation, we don't have massive strikes on the civilian population, we don't have destruction of infrastructure, we don't have the continuation of a war that has been going on for almost 4.5 years. I mean, none of that is happening. And accordingly, if Ukraine continues to defend itself, and I emphasize again, effective defense is only possible on Russian territory, meaning taking the war into Russian territory, then that will somehow provoke them and they will somehow attack us, right? You couldn't come up with a more ridiculous argument, but this is exactly what characterizes these non-agentic Russian immigrants. Yes, because they still haven't understood the main thing. Putin can only be stopped by force and through fear. All these white coats, little bells, little candles, voting, smart voting, when they vote for any other party in power instead of United Russia, for example, for the Communist Party or, say, the New People Party. These are the same parties of power that call for the maximum escalation of a genocidal war. So for me, these people have already reached their end here. All these immigrants, yes, that is, at this point, they're finished. And accordingly, to debate with them about things they don't understand, things they don't grasp. And what's more, all these people still haven't proposed any other model for influencing Putin. Well, except, I emphasize again, dancing, yes, around the Christmas tree, the winter one, so it's really useless to have a discussion with them. What is needed and how should a discussion be conducted? With our partners, we need to explain the escalation is continuing, and this escalation will affect international relations more and more deeply and hit even distant countries, including the United States, because I repeat once again, and China, because it is breaking down international relations. I repeat once again. Second, one needs to talk to Russia only by increasing the volume. They are not enough. The main thing is that it's not enough. There are too few of them. I mean, talking to the Russian voter, or the potential one, since there haven't been real elections there for a long time, or the electorate, let's put it that way. Again, potential voters, because there are no elections, it's only possible through increasing strikes on Russian territory. That is, the more they feel the war outside their window, the more they suffer losses, directly, personally suffer losses from the war. The faster internal discontent will grow, which will be expressed in classic Russian riots. The system won't work any other way. And finally, we need to talk to businesses, economies, and governments, including those of neutral countries, explaining that opportunistic profit from Russia, speculative profit from Russia, is nothing compared to the losses we will all incur together if this war continues. And accordingly, that means sanctions, restrictions, and the isolation of Russia. These are the main directions for discussion. Everything concerning non-subject characters, yes, who will point out where and what Ukraine needs to do after 4.5 years of their country's genocidal war, well, that's very strange.
You already mentioned the elections, the so-called elections, the electoral event that is being prepared in Russia. As a professional in political affairs, does it surprise you that Putin's administration still manipulates society so skillfully? All these stories with the Yabloko party, and it would seem they've completely immersed themselves in this discussion. And it turns out everything is still working out for them, for the Putin spin doctors?
No, nothing is working out for them, as strange as that may sound. And as of today, this is essentially the only mistake. Well, there are many technological mistakes there, but this is a major mistake with Yabloko, with the decision that Yabloko could channel all this dissatisfaction, the 100% dissatisfaction of those who oppose the war. It turned out to be exactly the opposite, yes. And accordingly, in the 2 weeks of participation, well, or rather, that kind of imitation participation by Yabloko in the election campaign, it turned out that a great many potential voters in Russia are ready to rally under anti-war slogans, yes, and are ready to support even a dead party. Yabloko has never been a full-fledged opposition party. Yabloko has always been a kind of decorative opposition party that played along in municipal elections, very often entered municipal government bodies, and accordingly felt comfortable within Putin's vertical of power for a long time. But even such a herbivorous party eventually sparked a real boom in anti-war sentiment. That is, they emphasized once again that far from everyone is ready to vote for the war anymore. Far from everyone is ready to support the war parties, to put it mildly. On the contrary, very many people hate the war parties. And this was demonstrated by the strategists over the course of 2 weeks. Why did they do it? Because, I emphasize once again, in reality, there haven't been any coherent sociological surveys or any coherent political technological constructs in Russia for a long time. A classic authoritarian vertical has been built in Russia where repression itself plays a dominant role, which is now rapidly increasing. I mean, we are now seeing sentences of like 7, 10, 20 years, yes, for essentially any sentiments that differ from pro-Putin ones. We are seeing very harsh arrests. We are seeing very harsh crackdowns on even any attempts to go out onto the streets, like for single-person pickets. And accordingly, since there has never been alternative politics in Russia, in principle, it has never existed, right? And now there are no mass media outlets either. So to say that there are some sentiments there that require correction through political technology tools, well, it's kind of strange, right? Moreover, any public speeches by Putin himself are definitely not aimed at a domestic audience, as many mistakenly believe. For Putin, there is no domestic audience. He doesn't need to persuade them. They will be repressed to the maximum extent. He has a fairly clearly constructed vertical of oprichniks, yes, who will clean all of this up. And accordingly, there is no point in persuading them to do something or not to do something, because there is no social contract. Any direct speech by Putin or any speech by members of Putin's inner circle is intended only for Putin and sometimes for the external consumer of these speeches. Again, these are not technological tools. These are direct tools of escalation. Therefore, honestly speaking, whether Kirienko's group exists or not, whether they are working on some technologies or not, none of this plays any role. Moreover, I will go even broader than that. All of today's hybrid manifestations, Russia's attempts to influence election results in various countries in Europe, and yes, they are successful, are not successful because there is some kind of political technology creativity present. No, it's because there is an absolute lack of willpower there from local authorities, a lack of willpower from local ruling parties, right? That is, they will knowingly lose to any primitive presence of Russia on their territories. I'm thinking not only Eastern European countries, but also countries of Central, Western Europe, Southern Europe, and so on. I emphasize once again, there is no, in Russia, in modern Russia, there is no pronounced political technological creativity, right? Everything actually comes down to three very primitive factors. It's the fear that is still present in many people there. The second is the unwillingness to take responsibility. And the third is absolute lack of will, or lack of will multiplied by corruption. Those are the reasons why it seems to many that Russia is capable of something technologically in the domestic market or in the foreign market. In reality, it's all a bit different.
If we talk about the successes of the team of technologists of Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky, and you belong to this team, very striking initiatives for the return of Ukrainian heroes to Ukraine, and in particular, the funeral of the commander-in-chief of the Sich Riflemen, Ukrainian political figure, colonel of the UNR Army Yevhen Konovalets, killed by NKVD officer Sudoplatov in Rotterdam. Mikhail, you were at this funeral, and obviously, you have a connection to this global idea of return. Could you explain a little about the goals and how this story will develop further?
Well, I would call the fundamental goal the stabilization of agency, the historical agency of Ukraine. That is, we need to clearly show why Ukraine was never, like, a part of the Soviet Union. Well, it's clear that territorially, in fact, yes, at some point they were inside an entity like the USSR, but from the perspective of ideology and self-identification, Ukraine was always separate and always independent. And in the historical context, it is necessary to solidify three things. Again, agency, historical memory, and an understanding of who we really are, how we differ, radically differ from those, I don't even know if Russians as such even exist, right? Because in reality, I don't quite understand what kind of nationality that is. Because as a rule, these are different ethnic groups within the territory of the Russian Federation. And as for Russians themselves, I don't quite understand what that is. So in principle, this task is exactly what all these decisions, the president's decisions, are supposed to accomplish. I emphasize once again, we need a clear fixation in world history of Ukraine's place, a clear fixation of Ukrainian identity, and its distinction from concepts like the Russian world. And finally, the third thing is establishing a future, right? That is, through agency today, through the fact that people are talking about us a lot, we are known and so on. Establishing ourself, right? That is who we are. In principle, these tasks are being addressed correctly right now. And in my view, despite some very strange statements from our neighbors, well, I mean, in my view, we are acting very clearly. We do not interfere in historical conflicts that concern other countries, even if these conflicts might not be to our liking and are somehow linked to our history in a negative context, because we understand that this also relates to identity. So, despite all of this, Ukraine is doing the right work today, once again solidifying the status, the historical status of the word Ukraine. And this, in my view, will provide us with a great deal of importance in the future.
Mykhailo, and if we talk about figures who are very well known even to those who know little about Ukrainian history, such as Stepan Bandera, Simon Petliura, and the great Nestor Makhno, can they also find a resting place in their homeland?
And for me, what is the mysterious nature of a question like this? You're asking correctly, but I mean the mystery of it. In the history of any other country, are there only positive figures present, right? Generally speaking, they only have a positive history.
No,
White and fluffy,
of course not.
walked around with milk, helped everyone, and so on. There are a great many figures who look negative to some and positive to others. And even for us, our own figures can look ambiguous, right? Positive in some ways and negative in others. I would also mention Mr. Skoropadsky. Yes, an extremely important figure for us, although many underestimate his role. And I would also mention many other hetmans and so on. This is our history. This is what shaped us into who we are today, right? That is, it sort of formed the archetype called Ukrainianship. And accordingly, regardless of how anyone feels about them, we must go through the process of realizing their historical role, their historical mission, talk it through, hold discussions, but within ourselves, right? So that all of this settles in. To clearly understand that each of them, regardless of their role in history, some, I emphasize again, are perceived positively, others negatively for certain actions. In reality, they all played an important constituent role in the formation of Ukrainianship as such. That's on one hand. On the other hand, again, historical assessments are given by different people, right? Then, through the prism of subsequent events, well, they say, right, that history is written by the victors. Unfortunately, victors are sometimes so repulsive, like the Soviet Union after World War II, which rewrote both the history of World War II and its own role, an extremely negative role in the start of this war, in provoking this war, and so on. The Soviet Union rewrote a great deal, and other countries have also very often rewritten the history of others. So all these actions by Ukraine are aimed at ensuring that we ourselves form our own opinion about where we come from, what we have gone through along this path, and what we have learned from it, from our historical path, and who we are in the future, right? And for that, it is necessary to have a precise understanding of all the people who shape this path. I mean, our people. And we ourselves will need to evaluate them, who they are, what they are, whether they were right or wrong in every individual aspect of their lives, in every individual historical period in which they live. Again, let's not forget, this is the third very important circumstance in which these people found themselves. The actions they took, what they were caused by, yes, what role other countries played in this, or the attempts by these countries to pressure Ukraine. Just like today, it is obvious that the history of this war must be written correctly. We are hearing absolutely disgusting statements from Russia, yes, which justify their genocidal actions against Ukraine. Just listen to what the trembling, yes, I won't call it a conversation because Lavrov doesn't have a full command of the Russian language, yes? How this extremely negative subject, yes, a historically disgusting subject, explains the war against Ukraine. He says, we cannot stop the killing of Ukraine right now, of Ukrainian children, women, the elderly, because it will somehow affect the memory of our grandfathers and great-grandfathers. Just think about that. And how are you talking to him, you subject? Maybe Lavrov needs a psych eval if he's talking to spirits. He'll explain it later, so their ancestors won't be offended. Look, we were killing Ukraine's children in the 21st century. You get it? This is important. It is important not to let subjects like Lavrov twist history, something that has happened many times before. And that is why what Ukraine is doing now in its history is separating the wheat from the Russian chaff.
It just so happened we have this historical part, because exactly 35 years ago, where were you from the 19th to the 21st, Mikhail? You were already 19. I was 7. As a child, I watched Swan Lake, and I remember that moment very well. Indeed, the coup began exactly 35 years ago. The GKCHP lost. The return to the Soviet era didn't happen. Hundreds of thousands of people, tens of thousands of people came out in Moscow. That's the famous photograph on Manejnaya Square. Listen, well, despite all the gloom, those events and those images give some hope that Russia does, after all, have the strength to stand up against the satraps sometimes.
No, unfortunately. Situationally, yeah. But then again, it was an unthinking protest that led to the formation. It was accumulated irritation that was vented. And it's good that I can afford to say a lot of things then, because I saw a lot of it directly with my own eyes. You are absolutely right. I was already sorta active back then, yes. So, Russia was both lucky and unlucky at that time. Because at the head of this protest, this swollen irritation with the USSR, were intelligent people, yes, and there weren't many of them, but they dominated in 91 and the first time, and in 93 they dominated, and so on. In principle, actually, this was an attempt by Russia to reformat from one absolutist vertical, well, the totalitarian Soviet Union back then, yes, party totalitarian, yes, party Politburo style, to transition to a classic czarist authoritarian vertical, as it turned out later. I mean, there was an attempt to make a czar out of Yeltsin, yes, especially out of the later Yeltsin. Well, he didn't succeed much because of certain psychological and physiological characteristics of that organism, his organism. And then, well, they built that vertical, unfortunately, the one they built, right? And we see that everything is now coming full circle because they chose the most negative character possible to be the successor. An absurdist successor to the most malignant pages of Soviet history. I'm talking about Putin now, right? I mean, a person who doesn't understand much, isn't very intellectual, has little knowledge, and completely lacks empathy and so on. Well, you could give many characteristics, but nevertheless. So, unfortunately, they came out back then, but like any intellectual protest, they don't have any power. Because then the parasites come along, I apologize for using that word, who parasite the revolution, right? And then gradually a parasitic vertical of power is formed in Russia once again, which is something that has always been characteristic of it. I mean, the Romantics, yes, that legendary phrase, they make the revolution, but it's used by, well, you know who, and accordingly, it happened very quickly. Just taking Russia as an example, they didn't even last for a few generational cycles, to form at least some kind of framework for democracy. Everything that happened in Russia, the elections up until 2003, the last free parliamentary elections were in 2003. In 2002, gubernatorial elections were abolished. Yes, well, that is, elections in the regions. Accordingly, in this short period of time, literally 10 years, they didn't manage to form this framework of democracy, of competitiveness as such. They slid back, and they couldn't do otherwise, because Russia is 95% made up of a slave population. I apologize. Yes, that is. Those people who do not need freedom as a concept. These people need, on the contrary, Tsarism. That is, a clear boss-like rule, right? Because Tsars in Russia are also essentially mob bosses, right? Meaning when someone tells you what to do, but at the same time guarantees that if you don't break certain prison rules, you'll always have your rations. So in principle, they would do that very quickly. And today, I don't have any. Well, you started with this, right? I mean, I look at these Russian immigrants, right? Especially those who once represented some parties who even went out to Bolotnaya Square in 2010, 2011, right? And I realize that all of this is completely alien to the modern democratic understanding and modern democratic ideology. These are people who are deeply infected with Russian thug culture and vulgarity, right? They might be in the opposition, but they view other countries and Russia's role in history exactly the same way, that it should bring everyone to their knees. They hate Ukraine and other former Soviet states just as much, believing they are all just younger brothers or sisters. All of this is completely inconsistent with reality, but they cannot break themselves of it. That is why this, unfortunately, closed spiral cycle in Russia is always being reproduced. That is, a Pak always comes along and starts killing the neighbors, then he gets overthrown, and the next Pak comes along. Yeah, it's like in Schwartz, To Kill a Dragon. Yes, meaning a new dragon comes along every time. The problem is that now Russia can finally move toward the destruction of this spiral. that is, to fade into oblivion. And the longer Russia drags out this war, the greater the chances that this country will disappear from the civilizational chessboard. That is very, very not bad. And it would very, very much help civilization move forward much faster.
Thank you, Mykhailo. Always a pleasure. A good conversation, and have a productive week. Mykhailo Podolyak, advisor to Ukraine's president, was our guest for this broadcast. I thank all my colleagues. Together, we have conducted this live broadcast. Thank you for your attention. I wish you a good day, and see you later.